cafe was small, warm, and always a little noisy in the evenings. It sat on a quiet street where people came to relax after long days. The lights were soft, the tables were close together, and the smell of coffee and fresh bread filled the air. Most customers came for comfort, not for anything special. It was the kind of place where nothing unexpected ever seemed to happen. She worked there almost every day. To most people, she was just another face behind the counter, someone who served drinks and cleaned tables without saying much. She wasn't the type who stood out or tried to get attention. Her voice was soft, her movements calm, and she always kept her head slightly lowered as she worked. People rarely asked her name, and she never offered it. But there was one thing about her that made her different, even if most people didn't notice it. In the corner of the cafe, near a window that looked out onto the street, there was an old piano. It wasn't shiny or perfect. Some of the keys were slightly worn, and a few notes sounded a little off. It had probably been there for years, used more as decoration than anything else. Still, every evening, when her shift slowed down, she would sit at that piano and play. At first, it had only been a quiet habit. She would play simple tunes, nothing too loud, nothing too bold. The music blended into the background, becoming part of the cafe's usual atmosphere. Most people didn't pay much attention. Some thought it was just a playlist playing softly through hidden speakers. But the truth was, every note came from her. She had learned to play a long time ago, not in a big school or with expensive lessons, but slowly, patiently, with whatever she had. Her hands had spent years learning the keys, making mistakes, trying again, and improving little by little. The piano had always been her way of expressing things she couldn't say out loud. Even now, she didn't play to impress anyone. She played because it made her feel calm, because it gave her a sense of peace in a world that often felt too loud and too fast. On most nights, a few regular customers would sit nearby and listen without really thinking about it. They would sip their drinks, talk quietly, and sometimes glance toward her for a moment before going back to their conversations. To them, the music was just part of the setting. But if someone had listened closely, they might have noticed something more. There was feeling in the way she played, a kind of quiet emotion that stayed just beneath the surface. It wasn't dramatic or showy, but it was real. Each note carried a small piece of her story, even if no one understood it. That evening started like any other. The sky outside was turning darker, and the cafe began to fill up with people escaping the cool air. Cups clinked, chairs moved, and conversations blended into a soft, constant hum. She moved between tables, taking orders and serving drinks with her usual quiet focus. After a while, things slowed down just enough. The rush passed, and the cafe settled into a calmer rhythm. She wiped her hands on her apron, took a small breath, and walked toward the piano. As she sat down, she didn't look around to see who was watching. She never did. Instead, she placed her fingers gently on the keys, closed her eyes for a brief second, and began to play. The music started softly, almost like a whisper. It flowed slowly, carefully, filling the spaces between conversations without interrupting them. It was simple, but steady, like someone speaking quietly in a crowded room. Near the window, an older couple sat together, listening without realizing it. At another table, a group of students talked and laughed, barely noticing the melody in the background. A man working on his laptop tapped his fingers along with the rhythm without even thinking about it. Everything felt normal. Everything felt the same as always. But even in that familiar setting, something inside her was different that day. She didn't know exactly why. Maybe it was the long hours, or the quiet weight of her thoughts, or something she couldn't explain. Whatever it was, it showed in her playing. The notes felt a little deeper, a little more honest. Her fingers moved with more confidence than usual, even though she kept the volume low. She wasn't trying to be heard. She was just letting the music come out naturally. For a brief moment, one of the waiters passing by slowed down and glanced at her. There was something in the sound that caught his attention, but he didn't stop. He just nodded slightly and continued working. Outside, a few people walked past the window, their reflections mixing with the soft glow of the cafe lights. Inside, the world carried on as it always did. She stayed focused on the keys. Each note connected smoothly to the next, like a quiet story unfolding without words. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. It was real, and that was enough. Time seemed to pass gently while she played. Minutes slipped by without anyone noticing. The cafe remained full. The conversations continued, and the music stayed in the background, steady and calm. To anyone watching from a distance, it would have looked like nothing special. Just a girl playing an old piano in a small cafe. But inside her, the music meant everything. It was the one place where she didn't feel invisible. Even if no one clapped, even if no one truly listened, the piano gave her a voice. Quiet voice, but a strong one. And as she continued playing that evening, she had no idea that something was about to change. Something that would turn that quiet corner of the cafe into a moment no one would forget. For now, though, she just kept playing, unaware of what was coming next. The music continued to flow gently through the cafe, blending into the soft noise of conversations and clinking cups. She stayed focused on the piano, her fingers moving slowly and carefully across the worn keys. It felt like any other evening, quiet and familiar, where nothing unusual was expected to happen. But then the door opened. A cool breeze slipped inside, followed by the sound of louder voices and confident laughter. A group of people stepped in together, their presence immediately noticeable. They were dressed neatly, their clothes sharp and polished, as if they had just come from an important meeting or event. The energy they brought with them felt different from the usual calm mood of the cafe. A few heads turned to look at them. The waiter near the counter straightened up slightly, ready to serve. Even the group of students by the corner table paused their conversation for a moment before going back to their laughter. She didn't stop playing. She noticed them, of course. It was hard not to, but she had learned to stay focused, to keep her attention on the keys no matter what was happening around her. So she continued, letting the soft melody carry on as if nothing had changed. The group chose a table near the center of the cafe, not too far from the piano. They pulled their chairs back loudly, sat down, and began talking right away. Their voices were confident, a little louder than everyone else's, and filled with the kind of ease that comes from being used to attention. One of them stood out more than the others. He leaned back in his chair as if the place belonged to him. There was a certain pride in the way he moved, a confidence that seemed almost too strong. He spoke more than the others, and when he did, the group listened. It was clear that he liked being heard. A waiter walked over and took their order. They spoke quickly, barely pausing, asking for drinks and food with casual certainty. As the waiter nodded and walked away, their conversation picked up again, filled with stories and laughter. Meanwhile, the music continued in the background. She kept her eyes on the keys, her posture calm, her expression neutral. But she could hear them. Their voices reached her easily, cutting through the softer sounds of the cafe. At first, they didn't pay much attention to the music. To them, it was just part of the environment, something that came with the place. But after a few minutes, the confident man shifted slightly in his chair. He tilted his head, listening for a moment. Then he let out a small chuckle. It wasn't loud, but it carried enough to be noticed by the people sitting with him. One of them glanced toward the piano, then back at him with a curious look. "What is that?" he said, not even trying to lower his voice. "Is someone actually playing this?" Another person in the group turned to look. "Yeah, I think so," they replied. "It's simple." He smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It had a sharp edge to it, like he had already decided what he thought. "Simple?" he repeated, shaking his head slightly. "That's one way to say it." A couple of people at nearby tables began to notice the conversation. The words weren't loud enough to disturb everyone, but they were clear enough for those close by. She heard it too. Her fingers slowed for just a second, almost stopping, but she quickly continued. She had heard comments before, some kind, some not. Most of the time, she ignored them. It was easier that way. But something about his tone made it harder to brush aside. He leaned forward now, resting his arms on the table, his attention clearly on her. "I mean, if you're going to play in public," he said, At least play something worth listening to. A quiet laugh came from someone sitting next to him. Another added, maybe it's just for practice. He shrugged. Then maybe practice somewhere else. The group chuckled softly, not in a loud or cruel way, but enough to make the meaning clear. A few people nearby shifted uncomfortably. The older couple by the window exchanged a quick glance. The waiter behind the counter paused for a moment, as if unsure whether to step in or stay out of it. She kept playing. Her face didn't change, but inside, something tightened. The notes she played remained steady, but her focus felt heavier now, like she was carrying more than just the music. She told herself to ignore it. Just keep going. That's what she had always done. But the man wasn't finished. He leaned back again, shaking his head with a faint smile. Honestly, he said, I've heard beginners do better than that. This time, the words landed harder. The small group laughed again, a little louder now. It wasn't just a private comment anymore. Felt like something meant to be heard. And it was. The sound of her playing began to feel different, even to her. The calm she had before was fading, replaced by a quiet pressure building inside her chest. For a brief moment, her fingers hesitated. One note came out slightly uneven. It was a small mistake, something most people wouldn't notice. But he did. There, he said, pointing slightly toward the piano. Did you hear that? Another laugh followed. The room didn't go completely silent, but something had changed. The easy comfort from before was gone, replaced by a quiet tension that spread slowly through the space. She stopped. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sudden. The music simply faded as her fingers lifted from the keys. The last note lingered for a second, then disappeared. The cafe felt different without it. For the first time that evening, she looked up. Her eyes moved across the room, not searching for anyone in particular, but aware of every glance, every quiet reaction. A few people looked away quickly. Others watched, unsure of what would happen next. Her gaze passed over the group, landing briefly on the man who had been speaking. He met her eyes for a moment. There was no apology there, no hesitation, just the same confident expression, as if he had done nothing wrong. He gave a small shrug, like it didn't matter. She looked away. For a second, it seemed like she might stand up and leave, that she might walk away from the piano, from the moment, from everything. And honestly, no one would have blamed her. The silence stretched slightly longer than expected. Then, slowly, she placed her hands back on the keys. The movement was calm, controlled, but different from before. The room noticed. Even the group at the table grew a little quieter, their attention returning to her, curious now in a different way. She took a small breath, and though no one could hear it, something inside her had shifted. The quiet girl who played for herself, unnoticed and unchallenged, was still there. But now there was something else with her. Something stronger. Something ready. The cafe waited, holding on to that silence, unsure of what would come next. And this time, when she began to play again, it wouldn't be the same. The silence in the cafe didn't feel normal anymore. It wasn't the calm kind that comes naturally between songs. This silence had weight. It stretched across the room, settling over every table, every chair, every person sitting there. Even the soft sounds from outside seemed to fade, as if the world itself was waiting. She sat still at the piano for a few seconds, her hands resting lightly above the keys. Her fingers weren't moving yet, but they weren't pulled away either. It was like she was standing at the edge of something, deciding whether to step forward or turn back. Most people in the cafe didn't speak. Some looked down at their cups. Others glanced toward her, then quickly looked away again. No one wanted to make the moment more uncomfortable than it already was. The group at the center table had also grown quieter. The confident man who had been laughing before leaned back in his chair again, but this time his expression had changed just a little. The easy smile was still there, but now there was a hint of curiosity behind it. He folded his arms and watched her, as if waiting to see what she would do next. One of the people sitting with him leaned closer and whispered something, but he didn't respond. His attention stayed on her. Near the window, The older couple sat still, their eyes fixed gently in her direction. The man who had been working on his laptop had stopped typing completely. His hands rested on the keyboard, forgotten. The waiter behind the counter stood in place, holding a tray he had not yet delivered. Everything paused. She took a slow breath. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to steady her. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, and her fingers lowered closer to the keys. She didn't rush. She didn't look around again. Whatever she was about to do, it came from a place deeper than the room, deeper than the people watching. For a moment, nothing happened. And then, she pressed a single key. The sound was soft, but it carried. It didn't rush out or disappear quickly. It stayed, clear and steady, filling the quiet space in a way that made it impossible to ignore. It wasn't just a note. Felt like a beginning. A few people blinked, almost surprised by how strong such a simple sound could feel. She didn't move right away after that first note. She let it sit in the air, letting it reach every corner of the cafe. Her head tilted slightly, as if she was listening to it herself, measuring its weight, its meaning. Then she pressed another key, and then another. The melody didn't start all at once. It built slowly, piece by piece, like someone carefully placing each step before moving forward. There was no rush, no need to impress, just quiet control. The tone had changed. It was still soft, but now it held something deeper. There was feeling in it, something that made people lean in without realizing they were doing it. At the center table, the confident man straightened slightly. His arms loosened, his posture less relaxed than before. He didn't speak. He just listened. The people with him stopped whispering. Around the cafe, small movements began to fade. Cups were set down more gently. Conversations stopped completely now, not because anyone was told to be quiet, but because the music had taken their attention without asking. Her fingers moved with more certainty now. They didn't hesitate the way they had before. Each note connected smoothly to the next, creating a flow that felt natural and strong. It wasn't complicated in a showy way, but it was precise. Every sound had a place. The piano, old and slightly out of tune, seemed to come alive under her hands. Even the notes that were usually a little off blended into the music in a way that felt intentional. It was as if she knew exactly how to work with the instrument, not against it. The melody began to grow, not louder at first but fuller. It filled more space, reaching deeper into the room. It wasn't background music anymore. It had become the center of everything. The man at the laptop slowly closed it. The older couple leaned a little closer to each other, their attention fully captured. One of the students at the corner table stopped mid-sentence, forgetting what they were saying. And at the center table, the man who had laughed earlier was no longer smiling. His expression had shifted into something more focused, more serious. His eyes stayed fixed on her hands, following every movement across the keys. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at anyone. Her world was the piano, the sound, the feeling behind it. The music began to change again. This time, it moved from soft and steady to something stronger. The notes came a little faster, not rushed, but more confident. There was a quiet power building underneath the melody, like a wave slowly rising. You could feel it coming, even if you didn't know what it would become. A few people in the cafe took deeper breaths without realizing it. It was as if the music had reached inside them, touching something they hadn't expected. The man at the center table shifted in his seat. His earlier words seemed far away now, almost out of place. There was no sign of mockery left in his face, only attention. One of his companions glanced at him, as if waiting for a reaction, but he didn't give one. He just kept listening. Her hands moved more freely now. The hesitation from before was gone completely. In its place was a quiet confidence, steady and unshaken. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She wasn't playing for anyone in particular. She was simply playing. And that made it even stronger. The music rose slightly in volume now, enough to fill the entire room without feeling forced. It carried emotion, not loud or dramatic, but deep and clear. It told a story without words. A story of patience, of quiet effort, of moments spent unseen. A story of someone who had stayed silent for a long time and was now finally being heard. The cafe felt different. It no longer felt like a place where people came and went without noticing each other. It felt connected, like everyone in the room was sharing the same moment. Even the air seemed still. As the melody continued, there was no laughter, no whispers, no distractions. Only the sound of the piano. And for the first time that evening, no one saw her as just a quiet worker in the corner. They saw something else. Something they hadn't expected. Something they couldn't ignore. And as her fingers moved across the keys with calm control, one thing became clear to everyone in that room. This was only the beginning. The music didn't stop. It didn't even slow down. Instead, it kept growing, slowly but surely, like something that had been waiting for a long time to be heard. Every note she played felt stronger than the last, not louder in a harsh way, but deeper, fuller, more alive. Her fingers moved with a calm confidence that hadn't been there before. There was no hesitation now, no fear of making mistakes. Even the small imperfections of the piano seemed to disappear under her control. It was as if she understood the instrument completely, as if she knew exactly how to make it speak in the way she wanted. The room stayed completely silent. No one reached for their cups. No one checked their phones. Even the small sounds that usually filled the cafe, chairs moving, spoons tapping, quiet conversations, had faded away. It was as if the music had gently taken hold of every person there and asked them to stay still. Near the window, the older couple sat without moving, their eyes soft but focused. The man who had been working on his laptop now had it fully closed, his hands resting in his lap. The group of students in the corner leaned slightly forward, their earlier energy replaced by quiet attention. And at the center table, the man who had mocked her earlier sat very still. His posture had changed completely. He was no longer leaning back in his chair with easy confidence. Now he sat upright, his arms resting on the table, his eyes fixed on her hands. The small smile he had worn before was gone. In its place was something more serious, more thoughtful. He didn't say a word. No one at his table did. They listened. The melody shifted again. It became richer, more complex, weaving together sounds that felt both soft and powerful at the same time. There were moments where the music dipped low, almost like a quiet whisper, and then rose again, carrying a sense of strength that filled the entire space. It wasn't just music anymore. It felt like something personal, something real. Her face remained calm, but there was a quiet intensity in the way she played. Her eyes stayed on the keys, her focus unbroken. It was clear now that she wasn't playing for the room. She wasn't trying to respond to what had been said earlier. She was simply expressing what had always been inside her. And that made it impossible to ignore. A soft breath escaped from someone near the counter, as if they had been holding it for too long. Another person shifted slightly in their chair, but the movement was careful, almost afraid to break the moment. The music rose again, this time with more emotion. It carried a sense of quiet strength, like someone standing up without raising their voice. It didn't need to be loud to be powerful. It didn't need to be fast to be impressive. It just needed to be real. Her hands moved more freely now, gliding across the keys with ease. There was a natural flow in her playing, a rhythm that felt steady and confident. It wasn't forced. It wasn't rushed. It was controlled and beautiful. The man at the center table swallowed quietly. He hadn't expected this. A few minutes ago he had spoken without thinking, judging what he heard without giving it a chance. To him it had seemed simple, easy, nothing worth noticing. Now he couldn't look away. There was a small shift in his expression, something that looked like realization. Not sudden, not dramatic, but steady, like a thought slowly forming in his mind. The people sitting with him exchanged brief glances, but no one spoke. They didn't need to. The change in the room was clear. The music continued to build. It reached a point where every note felt connected, like pieces of a story coming together. There was a sense of purpose behind it, a direction that guided the sound forward. It felt like she was saying something, even without words, something about being overlooked, Something about being underestimated. Something about holding on to something quietly until the moment was right. The cafe felt smaller now, not in a physical way, but in how close everyone felt to the music. The space between people seemed to disappear. Strangers shared the same silence, the same focus, the same quiet understanding. And in the middle of it all, she played on. Her breathing stayed steady. Her posture remained calm. But inside the music, there was emotion that couldn't be hidden. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was something deeper. Something like truth. The melody began to rise towards something stronger. The notes came faster now, but still controlled, still clear. There was no chaos in it, no loss of direction. Every sound had meaning. Every movement had purpose. The energy in the room shifted again. Not tense, not uncomfortable, but alive. People felt it. They leaned into it. They followed it. The man at the center table slowly lowered his gaze for a second, then lifted it again. This time, his expression was different. There was no trace of mockery left. Only respect, quiet and unspoken. He didn't interrupt. He didn't move. He just listened. The music reached a point where it felt full, complete, like it had finally found its voice. It filled every corner of the cafe, not loudly, but completely. And then, slowly, it began to soften. The notes became gentler, calmer, like the end of a long sentence. The intensity eased, but the feeling remained. It didn't disappear. It stayed, resting quietly in the air. Her hands slowed. The movement became lighter. The final part of the melody unfolded with care, each note placed exactly where it needed to be. No one moved. No one spoke. The room held onto every sound. And then, with one last gentle touch, she played the final note. It lingered for a moment, then faded. Silence returned. But this time it wasn't heavy or uncomfortable. It was full, meaningful, complete. For a few seconds, no one reacted. It was as if the room needed time to understand what had just happened. Then, slowly, someone near the back began to clap. The sound was soft at first, almost uncertain. But it didn't stay that way. Another person joined in, then another, and suddenly, the entire cafe filled with applause. It wasn't loud in a chaotic way. It was strong, steady, and real. It came from every corner of the room, from people who had been silent just moments before. The older couple clapped with gentle smiles. The students clapped with wide eyes, still surprised. The man with the laptop nodded slightly as he joined in. And at the center table, the man who had laughed earlier brought his hands together slowly. His expression remained quiet, but there was no doubt in it now. He understood. She didn't look up right away. She sat still for a moment, her hands resting on her lap, her breathing calm. The sound of the applause reached her, but she didn't react immediately. Then, slowly, she lifted her head. Her eyes moved across the room, taking in the faces, the reactions, the moment that had changed everything. She didn't smile widely. She didn't bow. She simply acknowledged it with a small, calm expression. And in that moment it was clear to everyone there. She had never needed to prove anything. She had always been enough. They had just taken time to see it. The applause didn't stop right away. It continued for several seconds, filling the cafe with a kind of energy no one had expected when the evening began. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was real, warm, and full of respect. People who had never noticed her before were now looking at her with genuine appreciation. She sat quietly at the piano, her hands resting in her lap. Her shoulders rose and fell slowly as she took a breath, as if she was grounding herself after everything that had just happened. The sound of clapping surrounded her, but she didn't react in a dramatic way. She simply listened. For a moment, it felt like time had paused again. Then, slowly, the applause began to fade. Not because people didn't want to continue, but because they felt the moment had already said everything it needed to say. The room settled back into a quieter state, but it wasn't the same as before. Something had shifted, and everyone could feel it. She gently stood up from the piano. Her movement was calm and simple, just like everything else about her. She didn't draw attention to herself. She didn't speak. She just gave a small, almost shy nod, acknowledging the people around her. A soft smile appeared on the face of the older woman near the window. The man beside her nodded slowly, as if he had just witnessed something meaningful. The group of students exchanged excited looks, whispering to each other. But their voices were softer now, more respectful. The man who had been working on his laptop opened it again. But he didn't start typing. He just sat there for a second, thinking. At the center table, the man who had mocked her earlier remained seated, still and quiet. His hands rested on the table, no longer tapping or moving. His gaze followed her as she stepped away from the piano and walked back toward the counter. There was something different in his expression now. It wasn't pride, and it definitely wasn't amusement. It was something closer to understanding, or maybe regret. The people sitting with him looked at him, waiting for him to say something, but he didn't. For once, he seemed unsure of what words to use. She returned to her work as if nothing unusual had happened. She picked up a tray, adjusted a few cups, and moved behind the counter with the same quiet focus she always had. If someone had just walked into the cafe at that moment, they might not have guessed that she had just held the entire room in silence with her music. But the people who were already there knew, and they couldn't ignore it. A few customers approached the counter one by one. One of them, a middle-aged man, gave a small nod and said softly, "That was really something." He didn't say much more, but his tone carried enough meaning. She nodded back politely. "Thank you," she replied, her voice gentle. Another customer, one of the students, smiled and said, "You play beautifully." There was a hint of excitement in their voice, like they had just discovered something special. She thanked them again, her response simple but sincere. She didn't try to hold onto the attention. She didn't act differently. She just continued working, as if this was still just another evening. But it wasn't. At the center table, the man finally moved. He leaned back slightly, then forward again, as if deciding whether to stand up or stay where he was. His fingers tapped lightly against the surface of the table, a small sign that he was thinking. One of the people sitting with him spoke quietly. "You should say something." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked toward the piano again, then toward the counter where she stood. His expression remained serious, thoughtful. After a few seconds, he pushed his chair back. The sound was soft, but noticeable. He stood up. The people at nearby tables glanced in his direction, curious about what he would do next. The group with him fell silent, watching him as he took a few steps forward. Each step felt slower than usual, as if he was choosing them carefully. He stopped a short distance from the counter. For a brief moment he didn't speak. It was clear that this wasn't easy for him. The same confidence he had shown earlier was gone, replaced by something more real. She looked up when she noticed him standing there. Their eyes met again just like before. But this time everything was different. There was no tension in her gaze. No challenge. Just calm attention. He took a small breath. He began, then paused. The word hung in the air for a second as he searched for the right way to continue. "I didn't expect that," he said finally. It wasn't a full apology yet, but it was honest. She didn't interrupt. She just listened. He nodded slightly, as if agreeing with his own words. "What I said earlier, it wasn't right." There was no excuse in his voice. No attempt to make it seem smaller than it was. Just a simple acknowledgement. The cafe grew quiet again, not completely silent, but enough for the moment to feel clear. She looked at him for a second, then gave a small nod. "It's okay," she said. Her voice wasn't cold. It wasn't distant. It was calm, steady, and genuine. That seemed to catch him off guard more than anything else. He had expected something else. Maybe anger, maybe silence, but not this. He let out a quiet breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "You play really well," he added, his voice softer now. It wasn't said to impress anyone. It wasn't loud. It was just the truth spoken without pride. "Thank you," she replied. There was no long conversation after that. No dramatic moment. He gave a small nod, then stepped back, returning to his table. But the way he walked was different now. Slower, less certain but more real. The people sitting with him looked at him with quiet understanding. No one joked. No one laughed. The energy around their table had changed completely. Across the cafe, people began to return to their conversations, but in a softer way. The noise slowly came back, but it didn't feel the same as before. There was a kind of respect in the air now, something unspoken but shared. She continued her work, moving between tables, refilling cups, clearing dishes. But now people noticed her, not in a loud or overwhelming way, but in small, meaningful ways. A glance, a nod, a quiet smile. She didn't seek it. She didn't hold on to it. But it was there, and it mattered. As the evening went on, the cafe slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Customers finished their drinks, paid their bills, and began to leave one by one. The older couple stood up near the window. Before leaving, they paused by the counter. "Keep playing," the man said gently. She nodded. "I will." They smiled and walked out together. The group at the center table left not long after. As they stood, the man glanced toward her one last time. There was no need for more words. The moment had already passed, but its meaning stayed. He gave a small nod. She returned it, and just like that, they went their separate ways. The cafe grew quieter as the night moved on. Fewer people remained now. The lights felt softer, the space more open. She looked toward the piano for a moment. It sat in the same corner, unchanged, just as it had always been. But somehow it didn't feel the same anymore. Because now it wasn't just part of the background. Now it had been heard, and so had she. The cafe felt quieter than usual by the time the night began to come to an end. Most of the customers had already left, and only a few tables were still occupied. The soft lights reflected gently on the empty cups and clean surfaces, giving the place a calm and peaceful feeling. She moved slowly as she finished her work, wiping down the last table near the window. Her movements were steady, just like always, but inside, there was a quiet sense of change. It wasn't loud or overwhelming. It was something simple, something steady, like a small light that had just been turned on. The events of the evening stayed with her, but not in a heavy way. She wasn't replaying every moment again and again. She wasn't holding on to what had been said earlier or even what had happened afterward. Instead, she felt something new, something like quiet confidence. For a long time, she had played without expecting anything. She had sat at that piano night after night, letting the music speak in a space where no one really listened. She never complained about it. She never demanded attention. But deep down, a small part of her had always wondered what it would feel like to truly be heard. Tonight, she had felt it, and it had changed something inside her. She placed the cloth down on the counter and glanced toward the piano again. It stood there in the same place, quiet and still, as if nothing had happened. But she knew better. That corner of the cafe had become something more than just a place for background music. It had become a place where her voice had finally reached others. The waiter who had been working alongside her stepped closer, carrying a small stack of plates. He set them down gently and looked at her with a faint smile. "You should play again before closing," he said quietly. She looked at him, a little surprised. "Now?" He nodded. "Why not?" She hesitated for a moment. Not because she was unsure of herself, but because it felt different now. Before, she had played without thinking about who was listening. Now she knew people would, and somehow that made the moment feel more meaningful. There were still a few customers left. A man sitting alone near the back, slowly finishing his drink. Two friends talking softly near the door. The room wasn't full, but it wasn't empty either. She turned her gaze back to the piano. Then, without saying anything more, she walked toward it. Her steps were calm, but there was a quiet purpose in them. She didn't rush and she didn't pause. She simply moved forward, as if she already knew what she wanted to do. As she reached the piano, she sat down gently. The room didn't go completely silent this time, but there was a noticeable shift. The few people still there glanced in her direction, their attention slowly turning toward her. She placed her hands on the keys. For a second, she just sat there. Then she began to play. The music that came out this time felt different from earlier. It was still soft, still controlled, but there was a new sense of ease in it. She wasn't holding anything back. There was no weight from before, no pressure to prove anything. She simply let the music flow. The melody was warm and calm, like a quiet conversation at the end of a long day. It didn't rise into something dramatic or powerful. It stayed gentle, steady, and honest. The man at the back looked up from his cup and listened. The two friends near the door stopped talking and turned slightly toward the sound. The waiter leaned against the counter, watching with a relaxed expression. The cafe, though nearly empty, felt full again, not with noise, but with presence. Each note she played carried a sense of peace. It wasn't about being noticed anymore. It wasn't about being judged. It was just about being. Her fingers moved smoothly, without hesitation. The connection between her and the piano felt natural, effortless. The music didn't need to grow louder or faster to make an impact. It stayed simple, and that made it real. As the melody continued, she allowed herself to feel it fully. Not just the sound, but the moment, the quiet room, the soft lights, the gentle attention of the few people who remained. It was enough. More than enough. She didn't think about what might happen next. She didn't imagine bigger stages or louder crowds. She stayed right where she was, in that small cafe, in that simple moment. And she felt content. When the music came to an end, she let the final note fade naturally. There was no long pause this time, no heavy silence. Just a calm stillness. The man at the back gave a soft clap, followed by a small nod. The two friends near the door smiled and joined in, their applause quiet but sincere. The waiter tapped his fingers lightly against the counter in appreciation. She looked up and gave a small smile. Not wide, not dramatic, just real. She stood up from the piano and walked back toward the counter. There was no rush now, no pressure, just a quiet sense of completion. A few minutes later, the last customers left the cafe. The door closed gently behind them, and the space became still. The waiter turned off one of the lights, leaving only a soft glow behind the counter and near the piano. "It was a good night," he said. She nodded. Yes, it was. They worked together to finish the last few tasks. Cups were washed, tables were checked, chairs were pushed in neatly. Everything returned to its place. But something had changed. Not in the cafe. Not in the piano. In her. As she finished, she took one last look around the room. It was quiet, just as it had been at the beginning of the evening. But now it didn't feel the same. Before, it had been a place where she stayed unseen. Now, it felt like a place where she had been discovered. Not by the world, but by the people who were there. And maybe, in some way, by herself too. She picked up her bag and walked toward the door. Her steps were calm, her expression peaceful. As she reached the door, she paused for a moment and glanced back. The piano sat quietly in the corner, waiting. She smiled softly. Then she stepped outside. The cool night air greeted her, fresh and gentle. The street was calm, with only a few lights glowing in the distance. Everything felt still but not empty. She took a slow breath, and for the first time in a long while, she felt something simple and clear. She didn't need to be louder. She didn't need to be different. She didn't need to prove anything. All she needed was to keep going, one note at a time. And somewhere, somehow, the right people would always hear it.